The room went completely quiet the moment my sister smiled and said it out loud, that she was inheriting everything. Not half. Not most. Everything. Her voice carried across the lawyer's conference room with absolute confidence, the kind of certainty that comes from believing you've already won. The lawyer, Mr. Preston, sat behind his polished desk and didn't stop her. My uncle looked away, suddenly very interested in the certificates hanging on the wall. Someone in the back row actually nodded, like this made perfect sense. I stood there near the door, still holding the funeral program from 3 days ago, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. When my sister added, almost kindly, "Dad wanted it this way," something inside my chest burned. My ears rang with the unfairness of it all. I realized right then, in front of everyone who'd come to hear the will reading, family, distant relatives, even Dad's old business partner, that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was deliberate. This was a setup. And I'd walked into it completely unprepared, or so everyone thought. My hands stayed steady at my sides. My face stayed neutral. I didn't argue or cry or make a scene. Because I'd learned something important over the years. The people who talk the loudest aren't always the ones holding the real power. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who knows exactly what's coming next. I scanned the room desperately for someone to intervene, someone to question what my sister had just claimed. Surely someone would ask for clarification, would point out that this couldn't possibly be right, would remember that I existed too. But no one spoke. Uncle Thomas, Dad's younger brother, kept his eyes fixed on those wall certificates like they held the secrets of the universe. Aunt Vivian examined her manicured nails. Dad's business partner, Harold, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. The silence hurt worse than my sister's words. It was one thing for her to announce her supposed inheritance with such confidence. It was another thing entirely for every single person in this room to accept it without question, to let it happen, to act like I was invisible. Had they all known? Had they discussed this beforehand, decided collectively that I didn't deserve anything, that my years of sacrifice meant nothing? The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. These were people who'd watched me care for Dad through his illness. People who'd seen me handle hospital visits and insurance paperwork and midnight emergencies. People who knew exactly how little my sister had been around during those final difficult years. Yet here they sat, silent and complicit, as she claimed everything our father had built. My sister caught my eye across the room and smiled. Not apologetically. Not sympathetically. Just a small, satisfied smile that said she'd won and she knew it. That smile was what finally steadied me. Because arrogance like that always came before a fall. She sealed the betrayal with one perfect sentence, "Dad wanted it this way." For words that positioned her as the faithful executor of our father's wishes. For words that painted me as someone who would question what Dad wanted, who would be selfish enough to argue with a dead man's intentions. For words designed to shut down any objection before it could start. My hands started shaking, a tiny tremor I couldn't control. But I didn't react. Didn't interrupt. Didn't challenge her statement or demand to see proof. I just stood there, holding that funeral program, letting her dig herself deeper into a hole she didn't know existed. Because the thing about my sister, the thing she'd never understood, was that she assumed everyone else was as careless as she was. She assumed that if she said something with enough confidence, it would automatically be true. She assumed that no one would bother checking details or asking questions or verifying facts. And most of the time, she was right. Most people didn't bother. Most people took her at her word because it was easier than confronting her. But Dad hadn't been most people. And I'd learned from him that details mattered, that documentation mattered, that words on paper mattered more than confidence or charm or the ability to tell people what they wanted to hear. So I stood there, trembling but silent, and I waited. Because I knew something my sister didn't. I knew that Mr. Preston hadn't finished reading the will yet. I knew that there was more to come. And I knew that the moment she'd announced her complete inheritance with such absolute certainty, she'd made a critical mistake. She'd shown her cards before the game was over. This is the story of how my sister announced she'd inherit everything, and I revealed an amendment nobody expected, and the room shut down. I need you to understand that title. Need you to feel its weight. Because what happened in that lawyer's office wasn't just about money or property or inheritance. It was about years of being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. It was about being the daughter who showed up while my sister got credit for being charming. It was about watching someone take and take and take while contributing nothing, and finally, seeing that pattern break. The title of this story is also a promise. A promise that justice exists, even when it seems impossible. A promise that preparation beats arrogance. A promise that the quiet daughter who does the work without recognition might actually be 3 steps ahead of the loud daughter who assumes she's won. So when I tell you my sister announced she'd inherit everything, I need you to understand how complete her victory seemed in that moment. How total. How final. And when I tell you I revealed an amendment nobody expected, I need you to understand that I didn't do it with drama or confrontation. I did it with paperwork. With documentation. With the kind of quiet, thorough preparation that people like my sister never notice until it's too late. The room shut down not because I shouted or argued, but because truth has a way of silencing lies when it's backed by legal documents signed in Dad's own hand. This is that story. And it starts with me telling you exactly who I am. My name is Matilda Hawthorne, and this is the moment my real story begins. Not the story everyone thought they knew, the forgettable middle daughter, the responsible one, the caretaker who faded into the background. But my actual story, the one where I finally stepped forward and claimed the truth that was mine all along. I'm 32 years old. I work as a paralegal at a small law firm specializing in estate planning, which is ironic given what was happening in that conference room. I live alone in a modest apartment across town from the house where I grew up, the house my sister still lived in rent-free until Dad died. For most of my life, I'd been the dependable one. The daughter who came home for Sunday dinners without being asked. The one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries. The one who noticed when Dad's medication needed refilling or when he had a doctor's appointment he might forget. My younger sister, Vanessa, had been the golden child. Beautiful, charming, always knowing exactly what to say to make Dad smile. She'd float in occasionally, usually when she needed money or wanted to show off a new boyfriend, and everyone would light up like she'd bestowed some precious gift just by appearing. The imbalance had been there our whole lives. I'd accepted it years ago, or thought I had. But standing in that lawyer's office, listening to Vanessa announce her complete inheritance, I realized I'd never truly accepted it. I'd just been waiting for the moment when all that responsibility, all that quiet service, would actually mean something. That moment had finally arrived. I just had to be patient enough to let it unfold. We'd grown into our roles early, Vanessa and I. I was 7 when Mom left, too young to understand what divorce meant but old enough to see that Dad was drowning. Someone had to step up, had to make sure bills got paid and groceries got bought and homework got done. That someone became me. I learned to forge Dad's signature on permission slips. I learned to pack lunches and do laundry and call the landlord when the heat stopped working. Vanessa was only 4, still young enough to need taking care of, and I took care of her. I brushed her hair before school. I made sure she ate vegetables. I checked her homework and helped her practice spelling words. Dad noticed, eventually. Told me I was mature for my age, responsible, someone he could count on. I'd glowed under that praise, not understanding yet that being reliable meant I'd always be the one called when something went wrong. Vanessa grew up beautiful and carefree, protected from responsibility by my willingness to shoulder it. She learned that showing up and being charming was enough. That she didn't need to do the hard work because someone else would handle it. That consequences didn't apply to her because I'd always be there to fix whatever she broke. By the time we were adults, the pattern was set. I was the dependable daughter. She was the beloved one. And everyone, including me, had accepted that this was just how things were. The imbalance was so old, so established, that questioning it seemed pointless. Until Dad got sick and the imbalance became impossible to ignore anymore. The care years had started 3 years ago when Dad was diagnosed with early-onset dementia. He was only 63, too young for his mind to be failing, but age doesn't care about fairness. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and by Tuesday evening, I'd already researched care facilities, support groups, and legal documents he'd need to complete while he was still competent. I was there for every doctor's appointment, every specialist consultation, every medication adjustment and memory test and difficult conversation about his declining future. I learned about power of attorney and healthcare directives and the importance of getting everything in writing while the patient could still understand what they were signing. I took notes during medical appointments. I organized his prescriptions into labeled pill boxes. I set up reminders on my phone for when he needed to take each medication. I created spreadsheets tracking his symptoms and behavioral changes. I handled the insurance paperwork, the disability claims, the endless bureaucratic nightmare of dealing with a progressive illness. I called him every morning to make sure he'd taken his medications. I stopped by his house 3 evenings a week to check on him, to make dinner, to just sit and talk while he still remembered who I was. When he started having bad days where he couldn't remember simple things, I was the one who gently redirected him, who helped him find the words he was searching for, who pretended not to notice when he called me by my mother's name. Vanessa visited maybe once a month. She'd breeze in with flowers or expensive chocolates, spend an hour making Dad laugh with stories about her latest adventure, then disappear again. "She's too busy," Dad would say, making excuses. I never pointed out that I had a job too. That I had a life too. I just kept showing up. The first red flag appeared about 6 months before Dad died. Vanessa started asking pointed questions about the estate, questions she'd never shown interest in before. "Has Dad updated his will recently?" she asked during one of her rare visits, her tone carefully casual. I'd been in the kitchen preparing Dad's dinner while she sat in the living room pretending to keep him company. "I don't know," I'd replied honestly. "We should probably make sure everything's in order," she'd continued. "You know, for his sake. So there's no confusion later." Later. She'd meant after he died, though she'd been careful not to say it directly. Dad had been having a good day, alert and present, and he'd overheard the conversation. "Everything's handled," he'd said firmly. "No need to worry about it." But Vanessa hadn't let it go. Over the next few months, she brought it up repeatedly. Asked if Dad had a lawyer. Asked if his assets were properly titled. Asked if there was a trust or just a will. Asked who was listed as executor. Each question felt like she was probing for weakness, looking for gaps she could exploit. I'd noticed but hadn't said anything. Hadn't wanted to believe my own sister was circling like a vulture before our father was even gone. But the questions kept coming, getting more specific, more urgent. And Dad kept deflecting them, kept changing the subject, kept refusing to give her the detailed answers she was fishing for. Looking back now, I realized he'd been protecting something. He'd known exactly what she was doing and had been careful not to reveal too much. But at the time, I'd just been focused on getting through each day, on managing his care, on making sure he was comfortable and safe. I'd missed the bigger picture playing out right in front of me. The private conversation happened on a cold afternoon in November, about 8 months before Dad died. I'd stopped by to help him organize his paperwork, bills, insurance statements, the endless documentation that comes with managing someone's declining health. Vanessa had called earlier that day, asking again about the estate planning, pushing harder than usual. After I'd mentioned the call to Dad, he'd gone quiet for a long time. Then he'd asked me to stay after we finished with the paperwork. His voice had sounded tired but sharp, the way it got when his mind was clear and he was thinking carefully about something important. "I need to talk to you about something serious," he'd said, gesturing for me to sit down in his study. The room was the same as it had been for decades. Dark wood furniture, leather chair, shelves lined with law books from his years as an attorney before retirement. He'd been a sharp lawyer once, known for his attention to detail and his ability to anticipate problems before they arose. "I'm updating my estate plan," he'd continued, pulling out a folder from his desk drawer. "I want you to know about it because I need your help with something." My heart had started pounding. I'd assumed he was about to ask me to be executor, a responsibility I'd been dreading because I knew Vanessa would fight me on every decision. But that wasn't what he'd wanted. "I need a witness," he'd explained. "Someone I trust to verify that I'm making these changes of sound mind, that no one's pressuring me, that this is truly what I want." He'd looked at me directly. "I'm asking you because you're the only person I know who'll do it properly, who'll make sure it's documented correctly, who won't try to influence the outcome." That's when I'd understood this was serious. This wasn't just routine paperwork. This was Dad protecting his wishes from challenge. The amendment was a single revision to his existing will. Narrow. Specific. Legal. Dad had walked me through it carefully, making sure I understood exactly what he was changing and why. The original will had split everything 50-50 between Vanessa and me. Standard, fair, what most parents did. But Dad had added an amendment with specific conditions. If either daughter failed to provide meaningful assistance during his final illness, if either daughter demonstrated through actions that they prioritized their own interests over his well-being, if either daughter attempted to claim more than their share through manipulation or misrepresentation, then the distribution would be adjusted. The amendment laid out clear metrics for what constituted meaningful assistance, documented visits, handling of medical appointments, management of financial affairs, emotional support during decline. It wasn't subjective. It was measurable. Provable. I'm not trying to punish anyone, Dad had explained, his voice steady. I'm trying to reward the person who actually shows up. The person who does the work without being asked, without expecting recognition, without keeping score. He'd looked at me. That's been you, Matilda. For 3 years now, it's been you. And I want to make sure that when I'm gone, that dedication means something. The amendment included a redistribution clause. If one daughter met the criteria and the other didn't, the distribution would shift from 50-50 to 70-30. Not everything. Dad had been fair even in his disappointment. But enough to acknowledge the imbalance, to correct the lifetime of Vanessa getting praised for showing up while I got taken for granted for staying. He'd made sure I understood the weight of what he was asking. This will be legally binding. This will be challenged. I need you to be absolutely certain you can verify everything if it comes to that. I'd been certain. I'd kept every calendar entry, every receipt, every documented visit. Not because I'd known about the amendment, but because that's who I'd become, someone who documented everything, who kept records, who prepared for problems before they arrived. Don't tell your sister, Dad had said after I'd signed as witness to the amendment. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction, delivered with the kind of firmness that meant he'd thought this through carefully. Not out of malice, he'd continued, seeing my expression. Out of necessity. If she knows ahead of time, she'll try to change her behavior. She'll start showing up more, helping more, doing just enough to meet the criteria. But it won't be real. It'll be performance. He'd been right, of course. Vanessa was excellent at performing when she knew she was being evaluated. She could charm anyone for short periods. But she couldn't sustain it. Couldn't maintain the facade when no one was watching, when there was no immediate benefit, when it required real sacrifice instead of convenient gestures. The amendment is designed to measure authentic care, Dad had explained. 3 years of demonstrated commitment. That can't be faked in a few months once she knows she's being tested. So I'd agreed to keep it secret. Had watched Vanessa continue her pattern of occasional visits and constant requests for information about Dad's estate. Had said nothing when she asked if I knew what was in the will. Had simply replied that Dad kept his legal affairs private, which was technically true. The secret had sat in my chest like a stone for 8 months. Heavy but necessary. A weight I'd carried alone because Dad had trusted me with it, and I wouldn't betray that trust no matter how much I wanted to warn Vanessa that her behavior had consequences. That warning had stayed with me through Dad's final months. Through his death. Through the funeral where Vanessa had cried dramatically while I'd stood dry-eyed and numb. Through the phone call from Mr. Preston's office scheduling the will reading. Through walking into that conference room and watching my sister announce with absolute confidence that she was inheriting everything. And now, finally, it was time to honor that trust by letting the truth speak for itself. The funeral had been 3 days ago, and Vanessa's performance had been flawless. She'd worn a perfectly tailored black dress, designer but tasteful. Her makeup had been immaculate, complete with tears that never quite smudged her mascara. She'd stood at the front of the church accepting condolences with graceful grief, holding people's hands, thanking them for coming, looking every inch the devoted daughter mourning her beloved father. People had eaten it up. She's holding up so well, I'd heard someone whisper. So strong. She and her father were so close, another had murmured. This must be devastating for her. I'd stood in the back, dry-eyed and quiet, and let them believe whatever they wanted. Let them think Vanessa's dramatic grief was more authentic than my silent sadness. Let them assume that tears meant love and composure meant indifference. I'd learned years ago that people believed what they wanted to believe, what fit their existing narrative. And the narrative had always been that Vanessa was the golden child, the beloved daughter, the one who'd inherited Dad's charm and charisma. At the reception, she'd told stories about Dad. Funny memories from childhood, touching moments that painted her as his confidant, his favorite, his chosen heir even before his death. She'd worked the room like a politician, making sure everyone saw her grief, heard her stories, understood that she was the daughter who'd really known him. I'd helped serve food and clean up afterwards, invisible as always. And I'd thought about that amendment sitting in Mr. Preston's office, waiting. Waiting for this exact moment when Vanessa had convinced everyone, including herself, that she was entitled to everything. The funeral had been her stage. The will reading would be mine. I just had to wait a little longer. Mr. Preston's office felt clinical and cold, too neat and organized for what was about to happen. The conference room had a long polished table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown business district. Everything was designed to project professional competence, to make clients feel like their legal matters were being handled with appropriate gravitas. I'd been in rooms like this before, both for work and for my own legal needs. I knew the setting was deliberate. Knew that estate attorneys chose these spaces specifically because they lent weight to difficult conversations, made emotional reactions feel inappropriate, encouraged people to stay calm and rational even when receiving devastating news. Vanessa sat at the head of the table like she belonged there, like she'd already claimed her position as the primary heir. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Vivian sat to her right. Harold, Dad's business partner, sat across from them. A few distant cousins I barely knew occupied the remaining seats. I'd taken a chair near the door, apart from the main group, positioned like an afterthought. Mr. Preston sat behind his desk at the front of the room, Dad's will in a folder before him, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked every inch the experienced estate attorney, grey hair, expensive suit, the kind of composed expression that suggested he'd delivered both wonderful news and terrible news hundreds of times and had perfected the neutral tone required for both. The room smelled like coffee and expensive furniture polish. Someone had brought pastries that sat untouched on a side table. Everything was very civilized, very controlled, very appropriate for a formal legal proceeding. Which made what was about to happen, the dismantling of my sister's confidence, the destruction of her assumptions, the revelation that would silence the entire room, feel even more powerful. Because it would all happen within these proper, professional boundaries. No shouting. No drama. Just legal documents and undeniable truth. Before Mr. Preston could begin the formal reading, Vanessa launched into her victory lap. She explained, with the careful tone of someone trying to sound humble while bragging, what she planned to do with her inheritance. The house will need some updates, she said, looking around the room. Dad let it get a bit rundown toward the end. I'm thinking of hiring a designer to modernize it while keeping the character he loved. Our house. The one I'd cleaned and maintained while Dad declined. The one I'd made sure stayed livable and safe as his mobility decreased. She was already calling it hers. And of course I'll need to review the investment portfolio, she continued. Make sure everything is properly managed. Dad was brilliant, but he wasn't really focused on finances these last few years. Because he'd been focused on not forgetting his own name, on managing medications, on getting through each day. But Vanessa said it like he'd been negligent, like she'd be saving his legacy through her superior oversight. I want to set up a scholarship in his name, she added, and this was clearly meant to make her sound generous. Something at the university. For law students, obviously, given his career. People nodded. Someone murmured approval. Vanessa smiled, pleased with the reaction, already positioning herself as the thoughtful steward of Dad's memory. I said nothing. Didn't interrupt. Didn't point out that she hadn't visited Dad's house in months. Didn't mention that she'd never shown interest in his finances while he was alive. Didn't question her sudden concern for his legacy. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, that funeral program in my purse, and waited. Because every word she spoke was another piece of evidence. Another demonstration that she assumed everything was already hers, that she'd won before the race was even finished. And that assumption would make her fall so much more devastating. The folder sat in my bag against my leg, a weight I could feel through the leather. Inside were copies of my documentation. 3 years of calendar entries showing visits to Dad's house. Medical appointment records with my signature as the accompanying family member. Receipts for groceries and medications I'd purchased. A log of phone calls I'd made checking on him. Email correspondence with his doctors and insurance companies. Everything dated, everything verifiable, everything proving exactly what the amendment required. Meaningful, sustained, documented care. I'd brought the folder without being asked, without knowing if I'd need it. Just in case. Because in my line of work, I'd learned that being prepared for challenge was better than scrambling to find evidence after the fact. Mr. Preston had a copy too. I knew he did because I'd delivered it to his office 2 days ago, along with a quiet explanation that Dad's will included specific conditions that would require verification. The attorney had reviewed everything with practiced efficiency, asked a few clarifying questions, and confirmed that my documentation exceeded the amendment's requirements. But Vanessa didn't know any of this. Didn't know that while she'd been planning her victory celebration, I'd been preparing a defense she hadn't anticipated. Didn't know that her confident announcement of complete inheritance was about to be contradicted by legal documents and irrefutable evidence. The folder pressed against my leg. I still didn't reach for it. Didn't need to yet. Mr. Preston would handle the initial revelation. My documentation would come later, if challenged. If Vanessa demanded proof. And based on the arrogance in her voice as she described her inheritance plans, she would absolutely demand proof. She always did when things didn't go her way. The folder waited. I waited. And Mr. Preston cleared his throat. The attorney cleared his throat in that particular way that meant the pleasant preliminary conversation was over and real business was beginning. The sound cut through Vanessa's description of the scholarship she planned to establish, stopping her mid-sentence. Everyone's attention shifted to Mr. Preston. He adjusted his reading glasses and opened the folder containing Dad's will. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice professionally neutral. "We're gathered to review the last will and testament of Theodore Hawthorne, properly executed and witnessed according to state law." He proceeded with the standard opening language, declarations of sound mind, revocation of previous wills, appointment of executor. Vanessa had been named executor, which made sense despite everything. She was better at public-facing roles, at managing logistics without emotional attachment. I didn't begrudge her that responsibility. The estate consists of the primary residence, investment accounts, retirement funds, and personal property, Mr. Preston continued, listing the assets with practiced efficiency. The total value is estimated at approximately $1.2 million after debts and expenses. I watched Vanessa's eyes light up. Watched her do quick mental math, already spending money she assumed was entirely hers. "The testator's wishes are expressed clearly in the following provisions," Mr. Preston said. Then he hesitated. It was subtle, just a brief pause, but I caught it. Caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the way he glanced at me before continuing. That hesitation was when I knew the script was about to change. When I knew that everything Vanessa had assumed, everything she'd announced with such confidence, was about to be challenged by the one thing she'd never considered. That Dad might have planned for her arrogance, might have built protections against her sense of entitlement, might have loved me enough to acknowledge my sacrifice in the only way that would matter after he was gone. "There is one addendum," Mr. Preston said, and those 5 words flipped the entire room upside down. The casual confidence evaporated instantly. Vanessa's smile froze. Uncle Thomas stopped pretending to examine the wall certificates and looked at the attorney with sudden focus. Aunt Vivian leaned forward. Harold shifted in his seat. The distant cousins exchanged confused glances. "An addendum?" Vanessa asked, her voice tight. "I wasn't aware of any addendum." "It was executed 8 months ago," Mr. Preston explained calmly, "properly witnessed and notarized, in accordance with state law governing will modifications." He pulled out a separate document, this one clipped to several pages of supplementary material. The addendum addresses the distribution of assets based on specific conditions outlined by the testator. Vanessa's face had gone pale. What kind of conditions? The testator expressed concern about equitable recognition of care provided during his final illness, Mr. Preston read. He established clear criteria for measuring meaningful assistance and adjusted the distribution formula accordingly. The room had gone completely silent. The kind of silence where you could hear people breathing, where every small movement seemed magnified. The addendum states that distribution of assets will reflect the documented level of care, support, and assistance provided by each beneficiary during the testator's period of declining health. Mr. Preston looked up from the document. This period is defined as the 3 years following his diagnosis of early-onset dementia until his death. 3 years. The exact timeline of my documented care. The exact period Vanessa had been largely absent. The distribution is calculated based on verification of visits, assistance with medical care, management of daily needs, and emotional support, the attorney continued. All of which must be documented and verifiable through medical records, calendars, witness statements, or other credible evidence. Vanessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time I could remember, my sister was speechless. For the first time in her life, my sister looked genuinely uncertain. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The confident smile slipped. The casual posture stiffened. Her eyes darted to me, then to Mr. Preston, then back to me, searching for some explanation for what was happening. "I don't understand," she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. She understood perfectly. She just didn't want to believe it. The addendum creates a conditional distribution, Mr. Preston explained patiently, like he'd done this hundreds of times. Based on verified care during the specified period, the estate division ranges from equal split to 70-30, depending on documented contribution. 70-30. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. 70-30. Vanessa repeated. In whose favor? Mr. Preston didn't answer directly. Instead, he continued reading. The addendum specifies that documentation must be provided by both parties demonstrating their level of involvement. Calendar records, medical appointment attendance, financial management, daily care assistance. All subject to verification. I felt everyone's eyes shift to me. Felt the weight of their sudden attention, their dawning understanding. Because everyone in this room knew, if they were honest, who had been there for Dad. Who had shown up consistently, reliably, without fanfare or expectation of reward. I have documentation, I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since entering the conference room. My voice sounded strange in the silence, calm and clear. 3 years of records. All verified and submitted to Mr. Preston for review. Vanessa's face went from pale to flushed. You knew about this, she demanded. You knew about this addendum and you didn't tell me. I was asked not to, I replied simply. By Dad. He wanted the evaluation to reflect authentic behavior, not performance designed to meet criteria. The implications of that statement crashed over the room like a wave. Dad had set up a test. Vanessa had failed it without knowing it was happening. And I had passed it simply by continuing to do what I'd always done. Show up, help out, take care of things without being asked. Mr. Preston read the amendment in its entirety, and silence followed every line. Meaningful assistance is defined as regular, documented visits averaging no less than twice weekly during the 3-year period. I had visited 3 times per week minimum. Vanessa had visited perhaps once a month. Attendance at medical appointments with healthcare providers, including but not limited to primary care, specialist consultations, and emergency situations. I had attended 47 appointments. Vanessa had attended 2. Management of daily needs including medication adherence, nutritional requirements, household maintenance, and transportation assistance. I had managed all of it. Vanessa had helped with none of it. Emotional support including regular communication, companionship, and assistance with memory exercises and cognitive stimulation. I had called daily. Had played memory games with Dad. Had sat with him through the hard evenings when he couldn't remember where he was. Vanessa had provided entertainment during her brief visits, then disappeared. The amendment laid out each category with precise metrics. Not subjective measures like love or devotion that could be argued endlessly, but specific, verifiable actions that either happened or didn't. Hours logged. Appointments attended. Tasks completed. Based on documentation provided by Matilda Hawthorne and verified through medical records, financial statements, and calendar entries, Mr. Preston read, the calculation of meaningful assistance shows a distribution ratio of approximately 85-15. 85-15. The number was even more imbalanced than the 70-30 maximum. Dad had built in a 70-30 cap to maintain some fairness, to ensure Vanessa wouldn't be completely disinherited even if she'd done nothing. But the raw calculation of actual care provided showed just how vast the imbalance had been. How completely I'd shouldered the burden while she'd coasted on assumptions and charm. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, processing what they'd heard, understanding finally what had really happened during Dad's decline. Understanding who had actually been there. Vanessa lashed out, but the accusations came from emotion, not logic, and they went nowhere. This is manipulation, she shouted, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. You manipulated Dad when he was sick, when he wasn't thinking clearly, to get him to change his will. Mr. Preston responded before I could. The addendum was executed while Mr. Hawthorne was still legally competent, as verified by his physician. It includes a competency assessment conducted specifically to prevent future challenges on those grounds. She influenced him. Vanessa insisted, pointing at me. She was there all the time, she had access, she could have pressured him into anything. The addendum includes specific language acknowledging that Matilda Hawthorne's presence was for caregiving purposes, not undue influence, the attorney replied calmly. Mr. Hawthorne anticipated this objection and addressed it directly in his statement of intent. He pulled out another page. I'll read the relevant section. I am making these changes of my own free will, with full understanding of the implications. My daughter Matilda has not requested, suggested, or pressured me regarding distribution of my estate. These modifications reflect my own assessment of each daughter's demonstrated commitment to my well-being. Vanessa's face was bright red now, anger and humiliation mixing into something desperate. This isn't fair. I had a career, I had a life, I couldn't just drop everything to play nurse. No one asked you to drop everything, I said quietly. Just to show up. To help. To be present. I was present, she protested. I visited. Once a month, I replied. For an hour. While I was there 3 times a week for 3 years. The math was undeniable. The imbalance was stark. And everyone in the room could see it now, could see what they'd chosen to overlook when Vanessa had announced her complete inheritance with such confidence. Could see that her sense of entitlement had been built on assumptions, not reality. On charm, not contribution. Mr. Preston explained the legal reality with professional calm, and his precision made everything final. The addendum is legally binding, he stated. It was properly executed, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized. Mr. Hawthorne was evaluated by his physician within 72 hours of signing and deemed competent to make legal decisions. He looked at Vanessa directly. You have the right to challenge this in court. However, I should inform you that such challenges rarely succeed when the documentation is this thorough and the testator's competency is well established. What are my chances? Vanessa demanded. Of successfully overturning this. Mr. Preston paused, choosing his words carefully. In my professional opinion, based on 30 years of estate law practice, I would estimate your chances at less than 10%. And that assumes you can afford extended litigation, which typically costs between $50,000 and $200,000 depending on complexity. The remaining 15% of the estate wouldn't even cover that legal fight. Vanessa would have to fund the challenge from her own resources, gambling money she didn't have on a fight she'd probably lose. The attorney continued. Additionally, the addendum includes a no-contest clause. Any beneficiary who challenges the distribution and loses will forfeit their entire inheritance, which would then pass to the remaining beneficiary. Everything. If Vanessa fought and lost, she'd get nothing. The incentive to accept the 70-30 split was overwhelming. The will as modified by the addendum is clear, legally sound, and reflects Mr. Hawthorne's explicit wishes, Mr. Preston concluded. There is no ambiguity to interpret, no procedural irregularity to challenge, no evidence of incompetence or undue influence. This is simply a father acknowledging the reality of who showed up for him when he needed help. There was no appeal here. No loophole. No way to argue facts that were documented and verified. Just the stark reality that Vanessa's assumptions about inheritance had been wrong, and Dad had made sure of it. What Vanessa actually lost wasn't just money, though that was substantial. She lost control of the narrative, of the family story, of her position as the golden child who could do no wrong. The room had shifted against her. Uncle Thomas was looking at her with disappointment instead of indulgence. Aunt Vivian seemed embarrassed. Harold was expressly avoiding eye contact. Even the distant cousins who barely knew us were clearly reconsidering their assumptions about which daughter had really been devoted. She lost credibility. Every time she'd complained about being too busy to visit Dad, every excuse she'd made for her absence, every casual dismissal of my sacrifice, all of it was reframed now as selfishness rather than legitimate prioritization. People were remembering all the times I'd quietly handled problems while Vanessa took credit for caring. She lost the room's sympathy. When she'd announced her complete inheritance, they'd been ready to accept it. Had nodded along, assumed it made sense. Now they were looking at her like she'd tried to steal something that wasn't hers, like her confidence had been arrogance rather than justified expectation. Most of all, she lost the story she told herself. The story where she was the good daughter, the beloved one, the child who'd really understood and appreciated Dad. That story was dead now, killed by documentation and legal language and the undeniable truth that showing up actually mattered more than being charming. I watched her process these losses in real time. Watched her realize that no amount of arguing would change the facts. That the family would remember this. That her reputation, her position, Her carefully constructed image had all just shattered because she'd assumed she could coast on charm instead of effort. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a quiet, sad acknowledgement that it had come to this. That Dad had felt the need to build these protections. That the imbalance had been so complete that only legal force could correct it. I could have taken more. The raw calculation had been 85-15, remember. Dad had capped it at 70-30 to preserve some fairness, to ensure Vanessa wasn't completely disinherited. But I could have argued for the full calculation. Could have pushed for every percentage point I'd technically earned through 3 years of documented care. I didn't. 70% was enough. More than enough. It acknowledged my sacrifice without being cruel. It corrected the imbalance without destroying Vanessa completely. It was, I realized, exactly what Dad had intended. Not punishment, but recognition. Not revenge, but justice. I accept the distribution as outlined in the addendum, I said to Mr. Preston. 70-30. No challenge, no argument. Vanessa stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. You're not going to push for more. Why would I? I replied. This isn't about taking everything from you. It's about acknowledging what actually happened. You'll still inherit substantially. You'll still benefit from Dad's estate. You just won't inherit everything like you assumed. The relief in the room was palpable. People had been bracing for a fight, for ugliness, for the kind of family warfare that destroyed relationships permanently. My acceptance of the existing terms diffused that. However, I continued, looking at my sister directly, I want you to understand something. This distribution isn't arbitrary. It's not me being vindictive or Dad being cruel. It's simply math. I showed up 85% of the time. You showed up 15%. The inheritance reflects that reality. Vanessa's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she didn't argue. Couldn't argue with numbers that stark. I'm not asking you to apologize, I said. I'm not asking you to admit you were wrong. I'm just asking you to accept that actions have consequences. That care requires presence. That being the favorite doesn't mean you were the most devoted. She nodded once, jerky and reluctant, but it was acknowledgement. And that was enough. I walked out of that conference room with no confrontation, no dramatic goodbye, no final accusatory speech. I just gathered my purse, thanked Mr. Preston for his professionalism, and left. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing. It was over. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, taken for granted, all of it validated in a single legal document. The sacrifice acknowledged. The imbalance corrected. I didn't wait for Vanessa. Didn't linger to see if she'd want to talk or argue or process what had happened. I just walked to my car, got in, and drove home to my modest apartment across town. That evening, I received a single text from my sister. I didn't know. About how much you did. I should have. It wasn't an apology exactly. Wasn't acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But it was something. Recognition. Maybe. Understanding. I typed back, you can still have a relationship with me if you want one. But it has to be real. No more assumptions that I'll just handle things. No more taking for granted. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, okay. 1 word. But it was honest, which was more than I'd gotten from her in years. I didn't know if we'd actually build that relationship. Didn't know if Vanessa was capable of the kind of reciprocal care that real family requires. But the door was open if she wanted to walk through it. And if she didn't, I'd be fine. Because I'd finally learned something crucial. I didn't need her validation or her appreciation or her acknowledgement. I had Dad's. And I had my own. And that was enough. The aftermath unfolded quietly over the following months. Vanessa sold the house, her 30% wasn't enough to maintain it, and she didn't want the memories anyway. I used my 70% to pay off my student loans, invest in retirement accounts, and finally take that trip to Europe I'd been postponing for a decade. I didn't chase closure with my sister. Didn't force conversations about fairness or sacrifice or all the years I'd felt invisible. I just built a life untouched by her arrogance, a life where my value wasn't determined by whether someone noticed my efforts. I changed jobs, moving to a larger firm where my experience was actually valued. I started dating again after years of being too busy caregiving to maintain relationships. I bought a small house with a garden where I could sit outside in the evenings and read without anyone needing anything from me. Vanessa and I texted occasionally. Surface-level stuff. Birthday wishes. Holiday greetings. The relationship was cordial but distant, and I was okay with that. Some damage can't be repaired, only accepted. Uncle Thomas apologized about 6 months later. Said he should have spoken up in that conference room, should have questioned Vanessa's assumptions instead of staying silent. I appreciated the apology but told him it didn't matter. The silence had taught me who could be counted on and who couldn't. That knowledge was valuable even if it hurt. A year after Dad's death, I visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. Brought flowers. Sat on the grass beside the headstone. Thank you, I said out loud. For seeing me. For acknowledging what I did. For making sure it mattered. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang. And I felt, for the first time since his death, genuinely at peace. Not because I'd won some inheritance battle, but because I'd been seen, valued, and recognized by the person whose opinion mattered most. My sister had announced she'd inherit everything. I'd revealed an amendment nobody expected. The room had shut down. And I'd walked away with something better than money, freedom, clarity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I didn't have to fight dirty to win. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power. And sometimes preparation beats arrogance without saying a single word. That was the lesson Dad taught me. That was the gift he left behind. And I'd carry it with me forever.